Hello, everyone, and welcome back to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, here as always with Charlie Araujo. How are you today, Charlie?
Well, we're recording this on election day, so ask me in a few hours how I am. I'm not sure. I mean, it's been crazy. I'll be glad to be through this era. I know we've talked about politics a little bit in the past, and you were involved with a lot of politics, and I was never really involved, but it is amazing with all the emails and texts, and I'm not even in a swing state. I can't imagine if you're in a swing state how bad it's been.
I know. I feel like I get 10 messages a day telling from random people telling me that I really need to give them money. Like, this has been day after day after day of that. But unfortunately,
Yeah,
this won't be over for at least a few more days because the major metropolitan areas never have their votes counted by the end of the night. And we're going to have multiple cities in swing states that are probably going to decide this election. So, uh, hopefully you weren't drinking too hard by at the end of the night because
Oh, well, let's just say I'm glad we're recording this today and not tomorrow. I think tomorrow may be a rough one, but hey,
yes.
the life goes on, business goes on, tech doesn't stop. Although interesting, we're actually not going to really talk about much about it today, but there is actually a fair amount of interest from a tech perspective in this election. So, it'll be interesting to see. We'll probably talk about that next week on what some of that fallout or outcomes may be. But with that, I think we should dive into the news.
Sure. So this has been an interesting week. A lot of focus on traditional tech, I would say, over the past week. We've talked about AI all the time, but the lead story for us is really around Microsoft's cloud, which I guess cloud computing is now legacy computing and old
Oh,
school.
it's about AI. What are you talking about? This is an
It
AI.
is about AI, but one of the interesting things that Satya Nadella brought up last week in his Q1 earnings call is that Microsoft is spending less time on model training on their cloud and a lot more on inferencing, which has been a big driver for the $10 billion in run rate that they have in AI revenue right now. According to Microsoft, this is the fastest that any product has ever gotten to a $10 billion run rate. I guess, at some point it becomes real money even for Microsoft.
Well, I think there are two big, like to me, almost shocking revelations in this, and then like a math equation that equals then something else. And the root before I mention what those are, I guess, is that we have to remember that all of this is baked into Microsoft's focus on Azure, which, in case you forgot, they were late to the game, and it is shocking. So the first shocking that they are now doing $10 billion in revenue on the Azure cloud specific to AI. That is just
Mhm.
staggering on both fronts. That how quickly they were able to sort of pivot and put this together. And I know it's been a while now in terms of whatever it's been 8 or 10 years, but it is still a pretty shocking turn. To have this much focus. So to me, the $10 billion number is a pretty staggering number. With the second revelation, because it's not just even most. I mean, what he said in this call was that they are turning away requests to use their GPUs for training because there's so much demand on inference. And what the math equation says what that equals is that means there are a whole bunch of enterprise accounts. Not, I don't think they're exclusively enterprise, right? There are tech vendors that use Microsoft, but I would think this is largely enterprise use cases that are using $10 billion worth of services for AI workloads, execution, operationalizing AI workloads. That is a staggering number. That, we talked a lot about how much of this is hype, how much of this is real. I would love to, I don't think they're going to give us more detail, but I would love to like dive into that to really understand where that is coming from and what is actually driving it. But um, that is certainly giving some credence to the fact that this isn't just a normal kind of hype cycle that is going to take years to materialize, that companies are aggressively moving down this road.
Yes, the level of experimentation is just astounding. And the fact that they Microsoft isn't even bothering to look at model training, it means there's a bunch of experiments that aren't even getting off the ground for Microsoft customers because Microsoft has to focus on the nitty gritty of actually getting things up and running rather than letting everybody do what they want to in playing with models and experimenting with potentially new model creation. So I find that surprising as well, that as much as we talk about the hype and as overrated as AI may feel in some respects, it is actually probably underrated in terms of the amount of revenue being put into AI and the effects that that has on the IT budgets. Obviously, there is growth, additional growth to be had in AI and in the IT budget, and this is probably going to be something that has to be formalized at the CIO level. We can't just continue to keep shoving these $10 billion annual spends under the carpet and just hope that we just find extra bits and quarters and dimes in the couch.
Well, I do think there's two additional elements here that I think are important to sort of take note of. The first is we've talked in the past about Anthropic and OpenAI and the fact that they're losing so much money. Well, in the same report, Microsoft announced that they had spent $20 billion in CapEx to generate that 10 billion in revenue, which is up from 14 billion the last quarter. Again, as staggering as that $10 billion in revenue is, it's overshadowed by the fact there's a double that in cost. Now that's CapEx spend, so it's going to get amortized, and they're clearly making these long-term investments. But it is sort of the economics have to play out at some point, and that's going to be the question mark, because particularly with inference, more than model training, is that's an ongoing cost, right? Not necessarily the CapEx side of it, but the operational cost of it. So that's something that I think there's going to be this ongoing sort of push and pull on the cost models around all of this. And then the other element that I think is worth taking note of, and I didn't share this article because I didn't have access to the full thing, but the snippet from she was called The Information. Is that what it's called? I think that's what it's called. And but they had an article, yeah, that is talking about the fact that this spending in AI is coming now at the cost. They're starting to see downward trend, that this budget is being pulled from traditional cloud spending, traditional SaaS spending, within the enterprise. And so that, I think, is interesting. This is not a completely new generative bucket of budget, that this is being pulled from other places, at least in part. And so that, if you're a software company that is not in AI, or this isn't your core, then that's something that I think you need to be thinking about and watching very carefully.
Yes, we talked last week about some of the Gartner IT trends and how IT spend was growing 7 to 9% overall, with a ton of that coming from data center, but also a fair amount of that spend increase coming from the software world, where you just need more and more tools, API references and calls. All of this is going into your AI, and there's no way to really get around the data quality, data governance, APIs, contextualization of models, the inferencing. That, like, all of this has to be part of the project and part of the ongoing maintenance of any model that you consider to be relevant to your organization.
Yeah, and I do think we may see a full-fledged realignment on how budgets. Another article that I didn't pull, but it was I forget. It was one of the major enterprises, like I think it was Transamerica or one of those, but talking about a complete structural realignment of their enterprise IT organizational model to be focused more around AI. I'm not sure if I'm in that seat that I'd be doing that level of restructuring today. I'm not sure that I believe that AI is the end all be all of everything. There's, as we've talked about, there's so much blocking and tackling, but it still points to the fact that I think we are potentially on the cusp of this reordering of the way we look at budgets. And I think that's going to lead to some challenging decisions, unless, of course, you're the federal government and the U.S. Air Force, and you just want to assign a very large contract for your cloud management. Because the other news that broke this week is that I guess Accenture won a $1.6 billion contract for the U.S. Air Force. And I guess it's technically a task order, so they may not spend it all, I guess is how it works. But and maybe you can explain it, but as I'm understanding it, for cloud management, it's not even cloud services, it's just the management of the cloud. I'm not clear on that, but it just,
Yes,
regardless of what it is, it's just a mind-blowing number.
huge number, right? That the Air Force thinks that that might even be the ceiling of the cloud services that they need. But Accenture's won this 5-year deal to manage just the Air Force's cloud environment, basically taking care of the operations as well as the FinOps, the financial management of the cloud. And there's this $1.6 billion cap on services. It starts with a measly little down payment of $2 million. So, practically nothing. But it's amazing to see how the cloud, which was supposed to make things run easily and make you not think about anything, now has these massive additional services that can be attached to them from a consulting perspective. So congratulations to Accenture for getting this contract. First of all, just kudos to you for somehow turning the cloud into a gigantic consulting job. It's great job.
Well, it's funny. It's in fact, we're going to talk about another article in a little while that addresses this fact. But it's like the tried and true method. If you want to sell something in the world of IT, is go sell it as if it's going to eliminate all the management overhead and headaches, and everything goes away. And then the consulting companies will follow up within a year or two and make boatloads of money doing all the consulting that you were sworn you didn't need. We've seen it with every single technology, and it's. I probably said that sort of cynically, I guess I am cynical in that companies keep making this pitch: cloud is easy, RPA is easy, take AI now is easy, right? Just plug it in, turn it on. But the reality is that our environments are insanely complex. The data models, the workflows, the business processes, it's all insanely complex, and so it doesn't ever surprise me that what starts out as simple, once we start to scale it and try to move it at velocity, that we're going to have issues that we have to deal with, and they're going to be big, hairy issues that take a lot of money and resources to solve for. So, I don't know if this is a good deal or not. But well, other than for Accenture, it's clearly a good deal for them. But I think it just is, don't buy the hype, and just always be pragmatic about, how you're looking at it. But was there any other big takeaway from your standpoint on this, other than the fact that, hey, cloud takes some work?
I mean, obviously, the big number, I joke about it, but at the same time, obviously, the Air Force has its own hybrid multi-cloud needs for governance. We obviously do not want to be giving away military secrets to the rest of the world, and that is necessary. But I think it also speaks to how CIOs have to think about managing the cloud more carefully, and that it's not simply as easy as trusting the cloud hyperscaler and leaving it up to them, even for just because they have the right categorized governance and compliance issues. We've talked about this in the past, how you can't always trust governance, and apparently the Air Force agrees as well.
Oh yeah, I think it's always a balancing act, always, right? And I think like I fell into it myself 10 years ago when we were just starting down the whole cloud road, and believing that you never have a data center. And I still largely believe that. I just don't think it makes it's like, why would I build a power plant? Although we're going to talk about that in a second. Historically, that just you sort of move past that, where it's no longer economically viable for you to be managing that infrastructure when you can buy it as a service. I think AI workloads and a lot of a lot of the modern technologies have complicated it a little bit, because cloud costs can become so exorbitant that it's this balancing act. I still think you end up more on a colo type model than actually running a physical plant, but it's just this sort of interesting dynamic, and which brings us back to the question, and I think it's becoming a question mark, is, are CIOs going to have to get back into the power business, right? I joked about the fact that, and I came from healthcare, and we actually had a power plant because our needs were so dramatic that we actually had our own. And in the early days of the industrial age, everyone did, and then quickly our infrastructure became such that we didn't need that. But AI is sort of turning that one on its side a little bit, and it's opening the questions like, do I need to be thinking, if I'm a CIO, from a strategic perspective about how I deal with power?
Right. So the Register had an interesting story last week about a company named Segro trying to open up its own data centers, and saying in some cases they have to wait a number of years because their local substations haven't been upgraded to support the power needed on the grid. And so we're starting to see this as an issue at the enterprise level as well. We joked around about the nuclear AI era in the past, and but it increasingly seems like that might be a little bit more serious and something that actually goes down market a little bit faster than we thought. And not coincidentally, at the same time, there's a very recent story just in the past couple of days about how the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, FERC, has turned down Amazon's relationship with Talon Energy. And I also took a look at Microsoft's recent relationship with Constellation Energy, not to be mistaken with Constellation Research, the analyst firm we all know and love. But apparently Microsoft's deal with Constellation Energy allowed them to buy energy for up to 4 times the going rate. So, if you're the energy company, Constellation, who are you going to give energy to? The city or somebody who's privately offering you 4x the amount? It's a pretty obvious choice, but we're starting to see some real potential impacts on grids and power generation, and we don't have easy answers to this.
Well, and it's interesting, given that it's election day, I think this is one of those domains where there's a political element, right? Because the large momentum has been around resisting increasing power thresholds and power capacities because it was viewed as, hey, we need to find alternative sources and green power and all of that. And it fully did not anticipate this massive surge in power requirements from these AI-driven workloads. And so we're now in a bit of a bind around it. And this is, like I said, from a political standpoint, this is going to be one of those questions that right now is not really surfacing, but is going to surface, is that how do you balance those? How do you balance those sort of competing demands and competing desires? Because there's, at the moment anyway, very little motion around actually improving power, reducing power consumption, improving power efficiency within these workloads. I mean, NVIDIA's made some moves in that manner, but it's right now not a primary area of focus. I personally think that that's what's going to happen, is it will find a way to drive these workloads more efficiently. And there'll be some leveling out where, people aren't using maybe as much, but this is going to be a challenge. And I think, as a CIO, I never thought I'd ever say these words, but you need to probably be thinking about power strategy on your strategic plan now, at least from a risk mitigation standpoint.
Yes, it's kind of wild to see IT and energy coming back together, because the past decade kind of got us out of the energy business in the IT world. I know it's been a long time since I seriously thought about energy draw as a serious IT topic, probably since before I formally became an industry analyst 16 years ago. was the last
I
time
don't
I
know
really
that.
thought about energy.
I mean, going back 25 years, I mean, we were worried about like power supplies and backups and making sure redundant power, like to
Sure.
protect against like someone backhoeing out a power line or something. But we never really worried about, could we get power, or, even for that matter, the cost of it. It was really just not a major factor in the grand scheme of things. And so it is this, I think there's going to be an entire generation of IT leadership that is like, okay, someone tell me how this stuff works, because it's
Mhm.
like, they're just not thinking about it.
Yeah, it takes me back to my early telecom days where we did care about power. And fortunately, there is a pretty good set of vendors that are supporting utility expense management and network expense management. So it might be time to open up some of your old vendor materials and start looking for some solutions there.
Well, I do think before I move on to our last couple topics here, I do think it's going to be an area that I know you're very invested in, that I followed a little bit, the whole FinOps space. I think I've made the case that FinOps needs to extend beyond just cloud, particularly public cloud management. And I think this is just another reason why I think this idea of having fine-grained control of your cost models and how the various workloads are impacting it, and now layering in the ability to look at the power consumption cost around it, it's just going to become a very critical function that for good or for bad, for most of the last 20 years, IT just hasn't had to worry that much about. It was all sort
Yeah.
of a capex thing. So it's I think it's a very interesting space, and I think it actually is a segue into this next story that I think is worth chatting about, and that is an interesting article from CIO.com talking about what they're calling their two-tier approach to Gen AI. And this isn't horribly novel on the one hand, but on the other hand, when I read this article, because I'm sort of like down on CIO sometimes, it's like I feel like a lot of their articles are fluffy.
Mhm.
This one I went through and it's like, that's actually some really good insights. And their basic premise is this, is that we need to be looking at Gen AI not in this one big bucket, but that there's sort of these two categories. There's what they call AI tools, which are things like ChatGPT, GTP, and the Microsoft's, Copilots, and the things that are general user productivity. And the challenge, as we've talked about with a lot of that level of tools, is that they are effectively driving incremental time savings. So they're really like efficiency plays. And in fact, somebody in the article called it time shavers, right? It's not anything, it's just like you're saving a little bit off every activity, and that can add up, but it's a small thing. And they're contrasting it with what they're calling AI solutions. And these are business focused, specific, typically tied to a specific workflow or a specific business process, and can actually drive a business impact at a holistic level, not just on an
Yeah.
individual productivity level. And the last part that was interesting is that to look at your investment strategy around AI, to separate those two, that they are not the same. But secondly, that AI tools become an on-ramp, meaning that an AI solution by definition requires a much more fundamental transformation of the way you work, of those operating workflows, and that can be scary and that can be traumatic. And so that the use of AI tools can be that gateway to get people used to interacting with AI in a way that when you then start introducing these solutions, it's less traumatic. And I just thought it was a really interesting insight of kind of how you look at it.
Yeah, and I liked that AI tool versus AI platform or AI solution approach as well, especially because I feel like that does get confused a lot when we're looking at the generalized AI tools. We're talking about something that ends up being more of a personal utility at the end of the day, but not necessarily as defined as, say, a spreadsheet or a word processor or a slide tool. This is going to be an addition to that, call it the Office suite or the app suite, productivity app suite at the end of the day, which is fine. But it does mean that there are limits to how productive this can be as a general tool, because we're basically talking about adding another calculator to the productivity suite. And I think there can be sometimes be some confusion about how to calculate the productivity of this, because we start shaving seconds off of a process and calling that productivity without even thinking, well, what am I going to use those 7 seconds for? Is there something that is higher value that I can actually complete in 7 seconds? Like oftentimes not. So it's a false type of productivity. If you've got something that's 7 seconds times 300 times a day, and then you can use that. I just outmathed myself, but if you could spend that extra hour on actually doing something useful, yes, that's valuable, but you're not guaranteed that, and it's hard to say you're going to use Gen AI like 200, 300 times a day to get to a meaningful amount of time.
Well, it's something I've been talking about for a while now. So is that IT, forget AI, for most of its history has been focused on efficiency, and efficiency has a limit. It has its value, right? But it has a limit. So
Mhm.
the real question is, how do you get to improving effectiveness and improving productivity? And to your point, productivity is rooted in efficiency, but we have to say, well, how am I transforming that into something that actually creates value in some way? Now,
Mhm.
sometimes that can be simply in the form of, hey, I'm making their life a little bit easier and reducing the stress levels. Some of my friends in the IT industry are spending, a lot of time talking about IT mental health. I think there's value in that. Right. So I think that there's lots of different ways we have to look at this. But the other thing I think that happens when you start putting these in these buckets and you look at them a little bit differently is you start to realize that these AI solutions, as this article is calling them,
Hmm.
require this fundamental transition or transformation of your business process, of your workflow itself. And this is becoming very, very important as we start thinking about the use cases around agentic AI solutions, because they are fundamentally sort of following along these workflows, these paths of
Right.
your business processes. And if you're not transforming them, then you're going to probably limit your ability to gain much out of it. And so it ends up causing you to really take this a much broader workflow or process centric view when you're talking about a solution. And that becomes this really strong demarcation point between that and how I would look at just a tool that sits there and sort of is available when I need it. Like you said, a calculator. So I just
Mhm.
thought it was a really useful framework and a really useful way of sort of looking at it. And I think we talked a couple weeks ago that Gartner identified the number one issue for CIs right now is having an AI strategy. And I think this is a great way to sort of help frame what that strategy should look like.
Right. But and when thinking about agentic AI or an AI solution, I think one of the biggest challenges right now is trying to figure out how do I create this open-ended UX that could provide me with a whole bunch of different types of answers without giving away state secrets or any sort of providing any sort of governance issues. For instance, recently I saw a chatbot that was supposed to be for healthcare, but it would also give racist answers, which you obviously don't want happening on behalf of a doctor or a nurse. Like all, these basic things that should have been checked beforehand, but never quite were. But they're possible for the same reason that AI, this generative AI, is also very valuable. That you do have a very open-ended set of questions and answers that you can potentially provide, and that's actually a strength as long as you understand that there are also governance issues that have to come into play at that solution level that have to fit into HIPAA and other basic personal identifiable information, all of these other issues that come into play for standard software and data use cases.
I think we're going to find that, if you're a CIO or if you're an enterprise leader, you start looking at this, you're going to end up, I think you're going to discover there's like this sliding scale. There's going to be some AI like ChatGPT, like the Microsoft Copilots that I can simply just install, hand it over to my employees, maybe give them a little bit of training on how to do prompt engineering, and off they go. And then at the other end of the spectrum, there is a whole lot of skin in the game where I'm having to really think about my data flow, my data architecture, my workflows, and exactly when and how I embed AI into that flow. And it's probably not going to be a single flavor. It's probably going to be elements of generative and traditional, predictive, and different components of it to actually deliver the outcome that I'm seeking. And that means a lot more of the onus is going to be on you as the enterprise team to figure that out and to orchestrate it. It becomes much more bespoke. And I think that's good. I think the average enterprise is going to end up with all of it. And it also opens up the door to, well, then how do you manage the responsibility? Because all of that is going to be enabled by these technology partners. And it just continues to increase the stakes, which is, I think, something that's pretty relevant right now, and maybe a lesson. I guess we'll see. But the other big sort of news this week was that Delta has sued CrowdStrike. If you remember, CrowdStrike had this big catastrophic failure that took a whole bunch of the internet down. I guess this was a couple months back now, right?
Yeah, back in July, an eternity ago.
Exactly. And so Delta has decided to sue them for $500 million in it. And so I have some broad opinions about the specific action, but the big takeaway I know that you were sort of mentioning was the fact that it points to the how reliant the modern enterprise is on all of these vendors for these really fundamental things.
Yes, Delta obviously was brought to a standstill precisely because it considered CrowdStrike to be a foundational part of its IT stack. But also, I think this speaks to uh, CIOs are always trying to figure out what is the what amount of damage is contractually permissible versus when have you broken the contract to an extent that you can ask for more than the cost of the software itself? Because obviously Delta was not paying $500 million a year to CrowdStrike, like, or any IT vendor, and honestly, very understandable that they wouldn't. But the fact that Delta was taken down to this extent, it'll be interesting to see what happens. Anytime you see a number that big, you have to assume there's going to be some sort of settlement, just to avoid going through the multi-year lawsuit and legal issues that might happen otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, as we talked about at the time, CrowdStrike, this was disastrous for them. What they did was horrible, and I think there was definitely negligence in terms of how they managed this, both allowing it to happen and then how they responded. So, I think from that level, I think that there's, they're not going to walk out of this unscathed. And from a CIO's perspective, it is as we talked about at the time, an important lesson of just really having to dig deeper than you think you have to understand your risk profile.
Mm-hmm.
I personally think, though, in this case, that Delta is overreaching, simply because the reason their impact was so bad was that they had their own failures, because their competitors were also hit and didn't have anywhere near the same impact. And so when that type of situation happens, it certainly means that they've got a lot more skin in the game. So I think this is a bit of a saving face thing, and it speaks to the fact that as a CIO, I think it's easy to sometimes almost believe that, well, it's everything's in these vendors now, that they're doing all of it. So much of it has to do with how you execute. That execution is all important, and I'm a little bit surprised that Delta's taking this tack, but I guess they feel like they can probably get some compensation, and they probably need it.
I know if I were still in my IT procurement seat, though, I would be staring at this lawsuit like a hawk the entire time to see the arguments that were made and how the court reacts, and potentially whether we could also use that same court if it is a positive result for Delta, because obviously you always want to figure out which courts and which judges you can potentially take advantage of in a worst case legal scenario.
Speaking of courts, judges, and fines, our closing, we always like to end on something that is fun or ridiculous, and this one absolutely qualifies. So a Russian court has fined Google, I'm going to try to read this, 2 rubles. A number that is beyond staggering. What did they say? I think it's more than the GDP of the entire world.
Yes. So the entire GDP of the global GDP, gross domestic product, is estimated to be somewhere between 100 and 120 trillion dollars. Like, nobody really knows what the number is, but it's in the 100 trillion, let's just say. So Russia decided, because Google had blocked some Russian sites on from YouTube for state reasons, all this back and forth at the political level. Russia obviously was not happy about it. Google actually left Russia in 2022, but Russia wanted to make sure that their decision made an impact. So they ended up finding Google not trillions, not quadrillions, not quintillions, not sextillions, but whatever, like 33 zeros, I think is a decillion. Like, it's
36 zeros, 36 zeros.
36 zeros, yes. So we are talking many orders of magnitude more than the gross domestic product of the world. Maybe the gross domestic product and resources of the entire universe. Who knows? But there's a lot.
I don't understand the point. I mean, I guess the article says it's because they had some calculation that every day it went, it kept adding, and of course Google is ignoring them, and so it's just this hilarious sort of thing. But In
Well,
related
I
news,
so
Accenture
I
has
did love
announced.
that logic though, that the fine
Yeah.
doubles every day. So it's like that rice problem that on the first day
Oh,
you get 1 grain of rice, the second day you get 2 grains of rice, third day you get 4 grains of rice, and then by the 30th day you own the entire kingdom. It's like
well, yeah, it's just insanity, but it's Russia, so I guess what to expect. I will be curious, whatever happens with this, if we ever get to back to kind of normal relationships with Russia. But on related news, Accenture has announced that they have landed a $1.6 billion contract with Russia to collect this debt. So, they're racking it up, I guess.
sure.
Craziness.
On that note, uh, it's been a wacky week, and we'll see what this week and election day holds for us. And if it impacts the CIO office, we'll be coming back to it next week. Thank you so much for joining us this week. If you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, comment, and let us know which aspects of the CIO office you're worried about for next week. Thanks a lot.